Hi, it's Katrina. Human puppet. An archaeologist in the United Kingdom discovered an ancient corpse that appears to have been turned into some kind of human puppet. The discovery came out of the southwest of England, dug out of a turnip field of all places. It was excavated by archaeologist and farmer Dr. Martin Green. Martin happens to own a lot of property and has quite an obsession with archaeology, so he actually excavates his own fields in hopes of finding amazing stuff. I think we need to meet. The amazing thing is that he's almost never disappointed. He even has his own private museum filled with things that he's found buried on his farm, like skeletons, ancient cows, pieces of prehistoric tools, and much more. It was in 2009 when he uncovered the eerie human remains from thousands of years ago buried in his turnip field. They were the ancient bones of a teenage female, and upon inspection, Martin noticed her bones had drill holes in them, likely made from either a razor or some kind of sharp flint tool. The holes appeared to have been used as a method to prevent the girl's body from deteriorating after death. She had these drill holes in her legs and her arms, and it's believed that she had been strung together with primitive rope, like some kind of ancient human puppet. For some reason, somebody had tried their hardest to keep her as whole as possible after death. Whoever buried her wanted to keep her bones from separating, so they carved holes and made sure that each bone was linked together with string. The truly bizarre thing about this discovery is that nobody knows why this would have been done, as we still have a very limited understanding of what people believed in 3,000 years ago. Civil War Field Hospital. The National Park Service has uncovered the grisly remains of a pair of soldiers dating back to the Civil War. They made the terrifying discovery inside a battlefield pit, once used by a surgeon to dump removed limbs after field surgery. According to the NPS, this is the first time that a surgeon's pit from a Civil War battlefield has been properly excavated. It's also the first time ever that actual bodies have been found in a pit that was supposed to have been used for amputated limbs. The excavated soldiers will be buried at the Arlington National Cemetery following examination, but there's not much that can be done for the 11 partial limbs that were found buried along with the bodies. So far, archaeologists have been able to determine that the soldiers were probably killed during the Second Battle of Manassas, though no one has been able to properly identify them yet. Both were males, both between 25 and 34 years old. One died from a bullet through the upper thigh, while the other was found filled with buckshot. Both soldiers had likely been seen as beyond saving by the field surgeon, which is why they were dumped in the Lynn pit and forgotten. Ancient Cemetery. Construction workers were building a new baseball stadium in Nicaragua's capital when they accidentally stumbled upon a mysterious ancient graveyard from roughly 1,000 years ago. The graveyard contained at least 30 pre-Columbian urns with remains inside. According to National Geographic, the cemetery belonged to a society that was never touched by the Spanish conquistadors. Workers with the National Electric Transmission Company were digging a ditch to create a substation which would be the support for the new baseball stadium. They noticed that some of the debris they were sifting through looked an awful lot like archaeological remnants, so they stopped and called in the archaeologists. Now it was the Institute of Culture that moved in to investigate. They say that the archaeological site was made sometime between the year 800 and 1350, during a period known as Sapoa. One of the issues with Nicaragua and archaeology in general is that the country has not been studied as much as places like Mexico and Peru. The Spanish arrived in Nicaragua in the 16th century, at a time when there were 3 very distinct tribes with their own languages and customs. But with the arrival of the Spanish came disease and pestilence, which wiped out pretty much all the indigenous people in Nicaragua. The people who were killed by the Spanish and their diseases had civilizations on par with the Maya and the Inca. It's just that they were systematically erased and then no one ever really went looking for them. This graveyard is an excellent example of an old Nicaraguan tribe, perhaps the Chorotega, that scientists still don't know much about. Finds like this one are awesome opportunities for researchers to learn more about these cultures. Ancient Leprosy. A skull has been found on an uninhabited Caribbean island. This in itself is extraordinarily rare. Joined by the fact that the skull has evidence of leprosy, things get even rarer. It's one of the only skulls found on the island that's ever been dated using radiocarbon dating methods. Most other human remains are dated based on whatever artifacts or materials are nearby. These bones come from the late 18th century, from a time when the island of Petite Moustique was used as a leprosarium. Think of a sanitarium, except for people with leprosy. Throughout the 1800s, when people became infected with leprosy, they were sent to isolated islands just like this one to prevent spreading the disease. People of the day just didn't know what else to do with the sick. And believe it or not, this did not only happen in the Caribbean, it also happened on the island of Molokai in Hawaii, with people who had leprosy being segregated from the general population. And although we know that leprosy was prevalent in the Caribbean starting in the middle of the 17th century, this is one of the first times archaeologists have actually found skeletal evidence of the disease. Leprosy causes the disfigurement of a person's hands and feet and face, spreading until a person's limbs are consumed. So it was common back in the day to isolate the sick and hide them, not only because they would become hideous, but because the average person didn't want to become like them. And so everyone with leprosy was shunned. Lockdown gardening discovery. During the pandemic lockdown in 2020, just like many of us who suddenly found ourselves spending lots more time at home, a homeowner in the southeast of England got bored. With all this extra time on their hands, they decided to do some serious yard work. So they took up gardening with a vengeance. While weeding their yard in April, however, they scooped 63 gold coins out of the dirt. The gold coins date back to the reign of King Henry VIII in the 16th century. Amazingly, 4 of the coins were found inscribed with the initials of various wives that the king had throughout his tenure as ruler of England. This includes Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Jane Seymour. But get this. According to the New York Times, this was only one of over 47,000 archaeological discoveries reported in England and Wales throughout 2020. The lack of things to do meant that many people took digging in the garden to whole new depths. We don't know exactly how much the amateur gardener made from the 63 coins they found, or if they even made any money at all. By law, people are required to report any finds to the government so they don't get lost or sold, so that history can be shared with everyone. Smoked corpses. In Papua New Guinea, you can find mummies that are far more terrifying than anything hiding in an Egyptian tomb. The Anga tribe, ancient people who live in the Aseki region of the country, are notorious for smoking their dead to create the grisliest mummies you would never want to see in your life. These people don't even wrap their dead in bandages or bury them. When a person dies, they are left fully to the elements, perched above a cliff to overlook the village where they originally lived. To us in the Western world, it might seem extremely creepy, but keep in mind that even the ancient Greeks would sometimes leave their dead on mountaintops to return to the elements. The mummification process starts with the removal of moisture from the corpse. Water is the main cause of decomposition, so those bodies need to be dried out completely, like raisins. To do this as quickly and easily as possible, the Anga heat the remains over a fire. The body is cut open at the knees and the elbows and other joints. Bamboo poles are stuffed into the slits, and then the insides are removed. There have been rumors that the leftover fluid from the bodies is used as a cooking oil, though this is complete hearsay and can't be proven. It is most likely a much more spiritual process like that of the Egyptians, who would remove all the internal organs and keep them in containers. Today, the mummies can still be seen overlooking the villages. They were first discovered by foreigners in 1907, when the British explorer Charles Higginson visited the area. But the practice came to an end in 1949, when missionaries finally settled in the region and convinced the tribespeople to discontinue their unusual mummification practices and convert to Christianity. Ancient murder mystery. Archaeologists in China have discovered the body of a young man who had been stabbed to death and then left inside of a tunnel 1,300 years ago. Chinese archaeologists are calling this a very ancient murder mystery. They first came upon the mystery while excavating a tomb at the Xianzi Cemetery in the Ningxia region. There, the young man's body lay riddled with stab wounds. The team was able to estimate his age at around 25, and they believe that he was still alive when dumped into the tomb shaft and left to die. The murder itself took place around the year 640 AD, but even with all the archaeological evidence, what happened that led to this unfortunate man being stabbed at least 13 times in a violent assault remains a mystery. They even found that his arm was severely cut, suggesting he had been trying to cover his face during the attack. The tomb he was found in is from the East Han Dynasty, between 25 and 220 AD. The vertical shaft in which the body was discovered was part of a robber's tunnel. Grave robbers had been going down to raid the tomb. The best guess archaeologists have is that the murder victim came across their crime and tried to stop them. Then, to cover up what they were doing, the grave robbers killed the bystander and hid him inside the tomb. After they finished pillaging it, the thieves covered the entrance to the tunnel and left the bleeding man to suffer and die. Iron Age settlement. Archaeological experts excavating Hirta, far in the north of an isolated part of Scotland, uncovered a settlement from the Iron Age. According to the evidence, what today is nothing but an empty chunk of grass and rock, far from society, was once a major social hub, with a population even higher than it is today. And I'm talking about 2,400 years ago. Archaeologists found pieces of pottery left behind by the ancient people who lived here. By doing radiocarbon dating of the food traces found inside the pottery vessels, researchers dated the site to between 400 and 100 BC. This was about a century and a half before the Romans figured out how to get to Britain and began to take over the island in 43 AD. If you're wondering how the experts knew there was a settlement here when all they found were pottery shards, it's because they found a lot of pottery shards. Plus, back in 2011, there was another Iron Age settlement found on the small island of Borere. Researchers deduced that there were several settlements set up here, a small grouping of villages, and that all remnants of their housing structures are gone. To give you an idea of just how barren this place is now, nobody has lived in the area in over 90 years. Yet back in 100 BC, Hirta and the rest of the St. Kilda Islands in Scotland were crowded with Iron Age folk. Ancient Crusader sword. In October of 2021, a scuba diver stumbled upon a piece of treasure 900 years old. The diver, who just so happened to be an amateur, was 13 feet underwater and 650 feet from the coast of Israel when he came across this incredible find. From out of the darkness, he saw the unmistakable shape of a sword. The blade was 3 feet long, with its handle totally crusted over with sea barnacles. Unable to contain his excitement, the diver grabbed the sword and swam to the surface. He then got a hold of the Israel Antiquities Authority and told them of his discovery. Putting the artifact into their hands assured that this amazing piece of history could be properly preserved. The diver believed the sword had been buried under the sediment, but had likely risen to the surface thanks to undercurrents moving the sand. The really amazing part of the discovery comes from what the archaeologists learned about the sword. Immediately, they recognized it as a sword from the days of the Crusaders. Its shape is the exact shape of a Crusader sword. Additionally, the sword was discovered roughly 1 mile from an ancient Crusader fortress, the Athlete Castle. For those who don't know what exactly the Crusades were, they were a series of military campaigns undertaken between 1096 and the end of the 13th century. The Crusades were fought by European Christians attempting to retake the Holy Land, mostly Jerusalem, from the Muslim rulers. This amazing sword had belonged to one of these European warriors, probably stationed at the nearby fortress. But how the sword ended up buried beneath the waves is still a mystery. Ancient desert tomb. In Egypt, a mysterious tomb has been opened to reveal over 50 mummies. 12 of the mummies were found to be children, while the rest were adults. They were all uncovered inside a burial chamber that goes over 27 feet into the ground. This amazing discovery was made in the middle of the desert, way south of Cairo and the Great Pyramid. The archaeological site is called Tuna El Gebel, one of the lesser known in Egypt. The underground burial chambers were carved out of rock, and they were likely made for a family that lived around the year 305 BC, during what is known as the Ptolemaic period. The tomb was definitely not used for royalty, but for a normal middle-class family whose identities are unknown. Only the mummification process shows just how important they really were. To make a bit more sense of this, keep in mind that around 2,500 years ago, having your loved ones buried inside an underground tomb was the same as being buried in the family cemetery today. If you could afford to be mummified, you could probably afford to have someone carve a tomb for you in the middle of the desert. Rare Roman statues. While working on the new HS2 railway system in England, archaeologists unearthed a miraculous trove of treasure from the Roman era. The shocking discovery was made at an excavation in Stoke Mandeville, when workers were digging up an ancient Norman church. They had already discovered that the original church was built over an even older Anglo-Saxon structure. It was in the final days of their excavations when they found that there was a third layer to the site. Beneath the crumbled ruins of the Anglo-Saxon structure were remnants of Roman occupation. In total, the archaeologists dug up 3 huge stone statues. 2 were busts, and 1 was just a head. The priceless discoveries were found together, with the bust being a representation of a man and the other a woman. The third statue, with only the head recovered, was of a child. All 3 were discovered surrounding a circular ditch and may have been vandalized before they were ripped down from wherever they had been on display. According to Dr. Rachel Wood, the lead archaeologist on the project, all the statues are in surprisingly good condition. They have been so perfectly preserved for over 2,000 years that you can still see the clear impression of the people the statues were made to depict. It's like staring into the eyes of the past. Archaeologists were also able to recover a hexagonal glass vase at the site, and now believes that they have uncovered all artifacts located there. It's incredible what the railway construction project had unintentionally unearthed about the history in the area. Gruesome golden mask. A creepy golden mask from over 1,000 years ago is hiding a gruesome secret. In Peru, a man was buried inside a tomb filled with an unbelievable wealth of artifacts, jewels, and pure gold. He was flipped upside down, his head was separated from his body, and a metal mask was placed over his face. The mask is still around today, showing huge beaded eyes of pure black, a pair of decorative earrings, and a blank expression that's enough to give you the chills. And to make things even stranger, the mask, which was fastened to the severed head, and the body of the dead man were painted in streaks of red. This burial was discovered 30 years ago, and it creeped archaeologists out back then too. But it was only recently that a team of researchers from the University of Oxford took an interest in the mask and the red paint. They were curious what made the red paint last over 1,000 years in the grave. They soon identified the red pigment as cinnabar. But there was another ingredient as well that bound the paint together and made it more robust. As it turned out, the second ingredient was human blood. The people responsible for the grave are known as the Lambayeque culture, and they predate the Inca by quite a lot. They lived in Peru between the 8th and 14th centuries and were obsessed with gold. The man buried here had 1.2 tons of treasure in his grave, most of which was gold. But why his head was taken off and he was buried with a mask of blood is still a total mystery. Mass sacrifices. 600 years ago in the northern coast of Peru, there was a terrifying massacre. Scientists now believe that at least 140 children, 3 adults, and 200 young llamas had their hearts removed during a massive ritual sacrifice in the 1500s. The sheer amount of bones was quite the shock. Gabriel Prieto, expert in archaeology at the National University of Trujillo, began excavating in 2011. He and his colleagues were stunned to discover so many skeletons of children especially, most of them between the ages of 6 and 14. Judging by the way the bodies were buried, all their deaths were part of a single choreographed event on one traumatic day. Their mummified bones were uncovered lying on their side, rather than the more commonly seated position, and none of them had any offerings buried with them. Some of the older children's faces had been stained with red face paint and were buried wearing ceremonial headdresses. Then each child was surrounded by either 1 or 2 young llamas. All the children, boys and girls included, were killed the exact same way. A single slice across the sternum caused them to bleed out and die. As if that weren't bad enough, researchers found evidence that their rib cages were open so that their hearts could be removed immediately after death. It's possible that this even happened while the heart was still beating. The question remains, what happened here? The sacrificial event took place around 1450, when the Chimu ruled the region. The empire flourished from the 11th to the 15th century, but something really bad must have happened towards the end for them to think that their gods were angry with them. Prieto and his team said that there were heavy rains and flooding in the area that could have caused catastrophic damage to the food supply. To stop the rain, they sacrificed their most precious possessions. Bodies from World War I. Over 100 years after World War I, a tunnel was discovered in France filled with the bodies of 270 German soldiers. These soldiers had been buried alive in the Winterberg Tunnel. near the small town of Crown in the north. They were part of the 111th Reserve Infantry Regiment participating in the Second Battle of the Aisne. They suffered a miserable death when a French artillery shell detonated on the tunnel. All entrances were closed, and the men inside were trapped. They were stuck inside the collapsed tunnel for 6 days before they were all dead. As the oxygen began to run out, the German soldiers either braved the airless vault and suffocated, killed themselves, or begged their comrades to kill them. Either way, all 270 of the soldiers died in the tunnel. Naturally, French authorities were not that eager to open the tunnel back up, and eventually people just kind of forgot about it. It was finally opened by a pair of amateur historians, a father and son team. Alan and Pierre Malinowski used a mechanical digger at a mysterious site where the pair had found the remains of machine guns, gas mask canisters, and other artifacts from World War I. Instinct told them that this was the legendary tunnel that had been sealed for over 100 years. So they dug through the earth until they finally broke open the tomb. What they found inside was terrifying. The men who had been trapped ever since May 4th, 1917 were still in there. The air smelled strongly of death. The pair sealed the tunnel back up and contacted the authorities, who now have been tasked with getting the remains out and back to their home country of Germany. Mass Peruvian grave. Speaking of terrifying discoveries in Peru, here's another one, this time from the Chan Chan Archaeological Zone. This is the location of the largest city anywhere in the Americas before the Spanish arrived. The Chan Chan people, also called the Chimu, came after the Moche culture and flourished from the 12th to the 15th centuries, just up until the Inca arrived. Chan Chan was the main city, with excavations going on here consecutively since 1969. That's how large the city was, even 600 years ago when it collapsed in 1470. Found in this enormous ancient city was a mass grave. The grave contained the ancient remains of 25 young females, all members of the Chimu culture. These skeletons date back to around 1100 AD, or about 1,000 years ago. What's so strange is that none of the females were over the age of 30, and they were all buried in a seated position with their legs crossed. According to John Juarez, one of the men behind the excavations, it's likely that the women were garment makers. They were found with tools of their trade buried beside them, such as needles and spindles. But nobody can figure out why 25 garment makers were all buried at seemingly the exact same time. It may have been some sort of ritual sacrifice, but it is unlikely since there doesn't seem to be evidence of violence. Juarez and his team say that they could have been brought to one gravesite from different graves as some kind of bizarre attempt to keep all the seamstresses buried in the same place. The New Orleans Underground. Today, New Orleans might seem like any ordinary above-ground city, albeit a little rambunctious. But beneath the surface is a secret trove of archaeological treasures. A lot of it has to do with Storyville, the infamous red light district that operated in New Orleans from between 1897 and 1917. After prostitution was declared illegal, Storyville was forced to shut down. It was at around this time that plumbing was being introduced to Louisiana. People started using indoor plumbing, and so their old, outdated privies in their backyards became dump sites for garbage. Over 100 years later, archaeologists have been finding terrible things underneath Storyville, buried in these ancient toilet dumps. One of the discoveries was a collection of preserved goat jawbones. They were taken from an outhouse pit beneath the French Quarter on St. Peter Street. According to archaeologist Ryan Gray, the goat jawbones were probably left behind by a tailor. Tailors often used goat brains to process and tan their hides. To get to the brain, the tailor had to get the whole goat head. This resulted in plenty of bones being tossed into the backyard dump. The Maya Train Project. In Mexico, over 100 previously unknown archaeological sites have been unearthed during the construction of a controversial train project on the Yucatan Peninsula. The reason the project is so controversial is that the train runs through an area that was once densely populated by the Maya, who, as you probably know, built massive cities throughout their empire between 2000 BC and 900 AD. Their descendants are still living in the Yucatan to this very day. The train project has so far led to the discovery of over 2,500 structures, 80 burial sites, and hundreds of potential gold mines for archaeologists. This shouldn't be any big surprise, though, considering the train is actually running right beside some of the most important archaeological sites in the country, such as Calakmul and Palenque. It has the potential to damage sites that are already there, while uncovering and then immediately damaging new sites that are nearby but previously hadn't been discovered. And all of this within the first 140 miles of the train line, which is supposed to be 950 miles in total. Unfortunately, the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico have not said exactly what's been found. We know that there are hundreds of archaeological sites exposed, but there seems to be a disturbing amount of silence on what's going on. We don't know whether these sites are being excavated, covered up, or potentially even destroyed. Coffin on the golf course. In a pond on a golf course in England, researchers discovered a strange tree trunk coffin. The tree sarcophagus dates back to the Bronze Age and was found to contain human remains and an axe. The amazing discovery was pretty recent, found in 2019. Construction workers were called in to renovate the golf course pond when they came across the coffin by accident. It's been dated to 4,000 years ago and is currently undergoing preservation at the Collection Museum in Lincoln before it's put on display. According to researchers from the University of Sheffield, the sarcophagus would have weighed about half a ton when it was put in the ground. It was made from the hollow trunk of an oak tree, then buried underneath a massive mound of gravel. Experts believe whoever was buried in the tree was an elite member of the Bronze Age society. This was an immense undertaking by the ancient people of England, and so it was reserved for only the top brass of the community. Mark Caswell, one of the members of the team, says the axe is so well preserved that it looks as though it was made yesterday. But we don't actually know if the axe was used in battle or if it was more of a symbolic burial good. To date, there have only been about 65 of these types of burials found in England. Number 8. The oldest anatomical specimen. The oldest anatomical specimen specifically used for medical research dates back to the 1200s. It might not be the oldest in the world, technically, but it is the oldest known in Europe. This gruesome thing is currently housed in a private collection. It consists of nothing except a human head and shoulders, looking like any Roman emperor's bust sitting on a stand in a palace. Except this one is a real human corpse. Oh, the top half. This individual had the top of their skull removed along with their brain and their face gnawed on by a rat. Their face even has traces of insect larvae that were probably laid after they died. As for the arteries, they've been filled with red metal wax to help keep the specimen preserved. We don't know exactly who this person was, but we know that they were turned into a medical specimen sometime around the year 1200. This was during the Dark Ages. Yet despite the barbarism of the Dark Ages, forensic scientist Philippe Charlier says this specimen is proof that they were still advancing ever so slightly with medicine. Somebody went through all the trouble of filling this person's circulatory system with beeswax, lime, and cinnabar mercury to preserve the body and give the circulatory system a bit of color. His body was dissected and then kept somewhere for continued medical education. He may have been a prisoner, he could have been institutionalized, or he could have simply been a dead man who was unwillingly donated to science. The Bactrian Treasure. The Bactrian Treasure is a collection of over 20,000 golden artifacts. It's the most legendary treasure in the history of Afghanistan, though right now, where it's actually located is a complete mystery. Let's go back to the beginning. Every last one of these 20,000 artifacts made from pure gold were uncovered from a series of graves at Tiliatepe back in 1978. These graves are over 2,000 years old. At the time of the discovery, the gold was placed on display at the National Museum of Afghanistan, as well as the Presidential Palace. There were gold rings, countless gold coins, weapons crafted from pure gold, and dazzling crowns fit for royalty. There was also a lot of treasure crafted from stones like turquoise, lapis lazuli, and carnelian. According to scholars, the graves belonged to 6 extremely wealthy nomads from Asia. They had likely been traveling across the region with a huge hoard of treasure on them when they died. Then, for some unknown reason, all 6 nomads were given the most impressive burial rites possible. They were entombed with their limitless fortune. None of their graves in the thousands of years after their passing were ever pillaged, and this is incredibly rare in the world of archaeology. Sadly, we don't know where the Bactrian treasure is today. We know that it was moved sometime in 2021 when the government of Afghanistan began to crumble. And we also know, based on reports coming out of Afghanistan, that the Taliban are currently searching for the treasure. The Taliban has stated that they will protect archaeological and heritage culture sites, but whether that is really the case remains to be seen. A terrifying delicacy. Archaeologists have uncovered proof of a terrifying delicacy that was enjoyed in the medieval days of Europe. The delicacy is a creature called the lamprey, one of the most primitive types of jawless fish in the world. Based on fossil evidence, lampreys have been alive for over 360 million years in one form or another. They can be found pretty much everywhere in the world where it's temperate, living in coastal and even fresh waters. Archaeozoologist Alan Pipe says that lampreys were a popular delicacy in medieval Britain, specifically for nobility, but they were also eaten as far as Spain and Finland, always by the richest members of society. One of the most bizarre stories is that Henry I of England had such a hunger for lamprey meat that his doctor labeled his cause of death as eating too many of these feisty creatures. And if you don't believe it, as recently as 1953, at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, lamprey pie was actually baked and served as well. The actual teeth of a lamprey were discovered during excavations near Mansion House Station in London. Only the teeth were found because these animals don't have any bones or jaws, so they don't leave much of themselves behind. But it was enough to show direct evidence that Londoners love to eat these creepy critters. Would you ever eat one of these unusual sea creatures enjoyed by medieval nobles? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We've got lots more videos like this coming up. And I wanted to give a big shout out to Nancy Mecchio and Poki Novakovic. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. Ghost Village. The village of Old Peruthia is located on the island of Corfu in Greece. It was abandoned in the 1960s, and then it became a ghost village. Hidden in the mountains, just far enough away from the coastal beach towns, this ghost village has recently been brought back to life. Old Peruthia was founded sometime in the 14th century during the reign of the Byzantine Empire. Today, it's the most ancient village anywhere in Corfu. It was built high up in the mountains, surrounded by forests to be safe from any potential pirate attacks. Back in those days, pirates frequently pillaged coastal towns, and there wasn't much the people living there could do about it. Old Peruthia was built where the pirates couldn't easily reach. Living in the secluded wilderness also helped the people of Old Peruthia to avoid diseases that spread along the coast, and they were also safer from mosquitoes. The beginning of the 20th century was when Old Peruthia turned into a spooky ghost town. Being secluded was fine before the modern age, but now people were moving to the coast in droves. Eventually, there were only about 4 people left in the entire village, earning it the title of abandoned. The good news is that now, Old Peruthia is coming back. While it was inconvenient for pirates, it's in a great location for the modern day, and slowly more people are trying to renovate this once spooky ancient place. The skeletons of Herculaneum. Archaeologists have discovered over 300 skeletons at the city of Herculaneum, near ancient Pompei. These skeletons once belonged to people who were alive in the year 79 AD, the year Mount Vesuvius erupted and decimated the city. But Pompei was not the only place that got destroyed. The Roman city of Herculaneum was also devastated. It's just not nearly as famous as its sister city. To understand the difference between these cities a bit better, Herculaneum was much closer to the crater. Whereas Pompei was buried under about 12 feet of volcanic ash, Herculaneum was buried under 69 feet of ash and other material. Most of that material turned into solid rock, which has made studying the second city a lot more challenging. As for the 300 skeletons, they were found on what used to be a beach. They appear to have been trying to flee the catastrophic eruption when they were killed by a sudden surge of boiling material spewed out of the volcano. Archaeologists described it as a scene of horror. They were only about 4 miles from Mount Vesuvius when it erupted, meaning they would have been practically incinerated immediately as they ran, preserved in rock for 2,000 years. The Phanagoria Site. The site of Phanagoria in the south of Russia contains the remnants of an ancient Greek city. The city is located on the edge of the Black Sea on the Taman Peninsula. The area was initially conquered by Russia back in 1828, but its history goes all the way back to the time of classical Greece. over 2,000 years ago. Scholars have been trying to unlock its secrets ever since it was found. They believe it could have thrived for at least 2 millennia before the Greek colonists living in Phanagoria suddenly vanished and never came back. Here's where archaeology gets weird in Russia. Expert Vladimir Kuznetsov has been working at the site since 1978, but has never had the financing to get very much done except for poke at the ground. In 2004, a local billionaire living close to Phanagoria decided it would be fun to fund the excavations. His name is Oleg Deripaska, and he donated somewhere around $16 million to the project. It turned into one of the most popular digs in the country overnight. We now know that a Greek colony founded this city in the year 543 BC. These colonists were likely refugees from Anatolia, from the time when the Persians attacked the area. Phanagoria developed into a city-state, traded closely with the Scythian tribes, and grew extremely wealthy and powerful. But then something changed. Around the year 1000, the city suddenly went extinct. Greeks who had been living there for thousands of years abruptly abandoned their homes and left. And even with millions spent to excavate and study Phanagoria, researchers still can't figure out why. Idol of the Painted Temple. The Pachacamac idol is an oddly disturbing wooden statue of a deity called Ixma. At least, this is who historians think the idol represents. To understand the idol fully, we need to go back to Peru in the 8th century AD. On the northern coast, there was a city called Pachacamac. This city was home to a small chieftainship, with the people here worshipping a god called Ixma. The city itself spanned over 1,500 acres of land, and for a solid 1,000 years, it was occupied by worshippers of Ixma. The principal place of worship was the Painted Temple, which today is nothing but a sad ruin, barely distinguishable from the desert in which it lies. The people who lived here didn't have much to do with the Inca Empire, but after the Inca were destroyed in 1533, the conquistador Francisco Pizarro sent his forces to the central coast, to Pachacamac. Francisco's brother Hernando then walked straight to the front of the Painted Temple, picked up a great idol representing the local people's god, and smashed it to pieces. The Spanish were absolute in their rule that the indigenous people would no longer worship their own gods. Everyone had to switch to Christianity. The easiest way for the Spanish to make sure this happened was by destroying the temples, smashing all their idols, and erasing their gods from existence. Fast forward to the 1900s, archaeologists found the sculpture of the Painted Temple in a heap of rubble. Some say it's the same idol that was smashed by Hernando Pizarro almost 600 years ago. The Carolingian treasure hoard. In 2020, a couple of amateur treasure hunters with metal detectors stumbled upon a hoard of coins from the 9th century. It happened in Poland, just outside the small town of Biskupiec. But unlike the Bactrian treasure that was made up almost entirely of gold artifacts, this treasure hoard was made up of mostly silver. A total of 118 silver denarii coins were dug from the dirt, with most of them dating from sometime between 814 and 877. This was the time of the Carolingians, a Frankish dynasty. The Frankish reached their peak in the year 800 when Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of Rome and Emperor of the Carolingian Empire. But when Charlemagne passed away in 814, the empire fractured. Within a century, the larger kingdom had splintered into the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France. As for the coins, they were minted about 50 years after Charlemagne's death. The ruler of the Carolingians from between 814 and 840 was Louis the Pious, followed by Charles the Bald. The coin hoard had probably been buried by someone who wanted to keep their treasure safe for later, but died and never got around to digging it up. The spiked vampire, an extremely rare skeleton, was discovered in Britain, with spikes jabbed through its shoulders, through its heart, and even through its ankles. Archaeologists say whoever buried this individual must have thought they were a vampire. What makes it so rare is that it was discovered in Britain, whereas most vampire burials are found in Eastern European countries like Romania. The person died sometime around the year 550 or 600, at the height of medieval paranoia. It's impossible to say what the locals thought this person was. It could have been a vampire, or it could have been a werewolf or a ghoul. The only thing that's certain is that the metal spikes stabbed through their body were to prevent them from ever getting out of their grave and feasting on the flesh of the living. Killed Crusaders. Archaeologists have uncovered the mass grave of a group of slayed Crusaders in modern Lebanon. In total, 25 men and teenage boys were uncovered at the bottom of a dry moat surrounding the ruined St. Louis Castle in Sidon. Radiocarbon dating shows that they were almost certainly Europeans from between the 11th and 13th centuries. They were Europeans convinced by priests and kings to pick up swords and reconquer the Holy Land. Sadly, most Crusaders were amateur fighters and didn't have much experience. Traveling those great distances back in the day would have already been a challenge, let alone wearing armor and trying to fight in a far-off place. St. Louis Castle was taken by Europeans during the First Crusade in 1110. The Crusaders then held on to the strategic point for over a century, until two devastating attacks in a row. The Mamluks attacked in 1253, then the Mongols in 1260. According to Richard Mikulski, one of the archaeologists working on the project, the men had probably died during one of these attacks. Richard went on to say that the soldiers were found with wounds primarily on their backs, which means they were probably running away at the time they were killed, and their bodies were dumped into the castle moat and forgotten. Slave family in Pompei. Historians and archaeologists have been obsessed with Pompei for centuries. It's one of the most popular and mysterious archaeological sites in the world, with more and more discoveries being made all the time. But the most recent discovery casts a bit of a shadow across the old Roman town. Archaeologists have uncovered a perfectly preserved room where a slave family once lived. For those who are unaware, Romans practiced some of the harshest slave tactics out of any civilization ever. And because history is typically written by the rich and powerful, there aren't that many examples in ancient literature about the lives of slaves. Finding an intact room where an entire family of slaves once lived and toiled is an exclusive look into the past, to something we couldn't have possibly known about otherwise. The room was preserved because of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. It looks like a storage closet, crammed with 3 wooden beds, a single wooden chest containing traces of fabric and metal, and some personal objects like ceramic jugs and a chamber pot. The room was not only an entire house for a family, each with their very own small and cramped bed, but it also doubled as a storage closet. Karahan Tepe. In Turkey, archaeologists found evidence that a prehistoric site from 11,000 years ago was the scene of a bizarre parade. The parade was part of a ceremony which involved a procession through a building that contained pillars shaped like male private parts and a single gigantic carving of a human head. The archaeological site is called Karahan Tepe. The buildings here date back to before writing was even invented. Archaeologists have found the carvings of snakes and foxes inside the remnants of the buildings, as well as the rather inappropriate pillars. They found 11 such pillars, all of them erected in the shape of a phallus. According to Nekmi Karul from Istanbul University, the building with the pillars was connected to a complex of other buildings, where ancient people held their ceremonial parades. However, Karul did not speculate as to what type of ceremonies were held here. The truth is that archaeologists don't know what kind of rituals and ceremonies these ancient people were doing. It was simply too long ago and they left behind no written records. However, they did leave behind lots of sexy imagery, so that's probably a huge clue. Gladiator holding cell. 172 years ago, a Roman amphitheater was discovered near Kent, England. You probably know by now that Rome invaded Britain around 2,000 years ago, and that it was the furthest reach of their great empire. The Romans built roads, towns, fortifications, and even amphitheaters in what is today England. This particular theater had been used for all kinds of exciting live entertainment, including gladiator battles. Even though the amphitheater was discovered a very long time ago, archaeologists only recently found a rather spooky cell. It was used to hold the people and even sometimes the animals who were about to be executed in front of a live audience. The theater was built in the 1st century and could hold about 5,000 spectators, and it would have been one of the most popular places in ancient England. The cell that was just discovered had been where the gladiators hung out as they waited to do battle, either willfully or with no other choice. Archaeologists didn't actually find gladiator bones in the cell. Instead, they found the random skeleton of a cat buried at the edge of the cell. They excavated the cat and named it Maxipus. Do you think this mysterious cat belonged to one of the gladiators? Let me know in the comments below. Buried Spanish treasure. A buried Spanish treasure from the 11th century recently ended up for sale on social media. The Amarguilla treasure, which is named for the estate it was found buried on, includes a set of 623 pieces of 11th century jewelry, including 98 pieces of gold, silver, and gilded silver. Included in the gold pieces are 4 wrist and ankle bracelets with joins that are shaped to look like birds' heads, as well as a beautiful and elegant Star of David set within a gold ring. The treasure dates back to 1009, when a civil war broke out in the Caliphate of Cordoba. This was when Muslims ruled the Iberian Peninsula of Spain, along with huge parts of North Africa. The war lasted for 20 years, with the end result being the defeat of Hisham II and the beginning of decline for the Muslim invaders of Spain. At some point during all this upheaval, it's most likely that a Jewish citizen took the treasure and buried it. They likely feared that the fighting would show up at their front door, and their valuables and jewelry would be stolen. Well, these fears had likely been correct because the hoarder never did dig up his gold. Something must have happened to him. Instead, the treasure remained buried for over 1,000 years. It was finally discovered by the police in an industrial warehouse of all places. Photographs appeared on social media depicting treasure that clearly had more value than your average gold jewelry and came from the 11th century. Alberto Canto, an archaeologist from the Autonomous University of Madrid, described the pieces as being part of the best collection of jewelry ever found from that time. National police then had to track down the person who had posted the images and had possession of the items in order to prevent any illegal trading of the treasure. What would you do if you found this kind of treasure? Let me know in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, because we have lots of videos about amazing discoveries coming up. City of the Dead. During routine excavations at Park Street in Birmingham, in the United Kingdom, workers discovered human bones. At first, it seemed like maybe there was a small graveyard or something underneath the street that people had forgotten about centuries before. But once the archaeologists arrived, it became one of the biggest archaeological discoveries in the history of Birmingham. Over 6,500 skeletons were found right underneath the street. It turned out the road was actually a cemetery way back in the 19th century. The city of Birmingham was built quite literally on the backs of its workers. The skeletons that were exhumed from the massive grave were in rough condition. Some were babies and kids without coffins, some of them had their feet or hands missing, and many of the dead bodies were buried with bowls of salt. Why bury the dead with a sprinkle of salt? It was because prior to the 19th century, when a lot of these people were buried, the locals believed that salt would keep away evil spirits, and even the devil. The only way to prevent their loved ones from having their souls stolen after death was to bury them with a bowl of salt. Further analysis of the corpses showed that many of them had scurvy or rickets. They were in poor health when they died, and they had atrocious nutrition. They were most likely the inner city workers from hundreds of years ago who were buried in a kind of backlog cemetery for the poor. Spider mutants. Researchers at the University of Wisconsin have used the scientific technique of RNA interference to create the very first spider mutants in the world. This horrifying discovery resulted in scientists creating the first genetically engineered daddy longlegs spiders. They first sequenced the entire genome of the daddy longlegs, then used RNA interference to shut off certain genes. They created daddy longlegs spiders with unusually short legs. According to Guilherme Gainet, the lead author on the study, they altered 2 Hox genes, which resulted in a gross malformation of the spider. Instead of being born with the normal long legs that give the spider its name, it had shorter legs, completely changing what the spider is supposed to be. While this might not seem that terrifying, unless you're the spider, it's opened the door to possibilities that are truly scary. Now that scientists know how to genetically create spider mutants, who knows what animals they'll experiment on next and what they might do. This is how all these superhero origin stories start, right? The Chief Treasurer's Tomb. In Egypt, archaeologists have uncovered the mysterious tomb of a man named Ta-em-Wea. In the days of King Ramses II, he was the chief treasurer. Back then, this was an extremely important role in the Egyptian government. The tomb was found in Saqqara, a massive necropolis just to the south of the city of Cairo. Saqqara itself has been in the spotlight in recent years because of a huge number of amazing finds, from tombs to mummies, ancient temples, and much, much more. But the tomb of the treasurer is unique in that it shows somebody who wasn't royalty, but a simple government official who worked closely with the pharaoh. The tomb was uncovered by researchers from Cairo University. They say that Ptah Mweya was the sole person in charge of Ramses II's treasury during his rule in the 19th dynasty, between 1279 and 1213 BC. Not only that, but he also served as the royal scribe, and he was the supervisor of cattle. He may have also presided over all the important sacrifices made at Ramses II's temple in Thebes. We are always so busy focusing on the major players in ancient history like the kings and the pharaohs, the queens and the princesses, we often don't take time to investigate the normal people. That's what makes finding Ptah Mweya's tomb so extraordinary. Jesus in a tree. There's a very disturbing sculpture of Jesus being absorbed inside a tree. To understand why the sculpture is slowly being eaten by a tree, we need to take a trip back in time to World War II. In the 1940s, the tiny village of Lubkov in Poland was nearly destroyed. Today, there are only a few pieces of the town left, such as an abandoned cemetery and the ruined foundations of a church. Most of the town, even its ruins, have been reclaimed by nature. The sculpture of Jesus is one of them. From what anyone can tell, the statue had once been your standard depiction of Jesus crucified on the cross. But somehow, a tree began to grow around the statue after the war. Since the town has been neglected for over 70 years, the tree has just kept on growing around the statue of the Savior. Now, the only parts of him that are visible are his head and torso. Nearby, even the wooden crosses used to mark the graves have also been consumed by the trees. Headstones are completely covered in moss, the wooden crosses are swallowed by roots, and Jesus is slowly being absorbed into nature by the trunk of a tree. It's a fascinating and eerie example of nature reclaiming its domain. Monte Alban's Tomb 7. Tomb 7 is one of the richest burial plots ever discovered in ancient Mesoamerica. Tomb 7 was unearthed at Monte Alban, in the Mexican state of Oaxaca. Monte Alban was the ceremonial center for the Zapotec people, as well as one of the earliest cities ever constructed in pre-modern Mexico. The city was built around the year 500 AD and became a sprawling capital within a short period of time. The city finally lost its power in the year 750, when neighboring states started flexing their own influence and breaking apart from the Zapotec people. Monte Alban was then abandoned by the year 900 and then repopulated roughly a century later. The people who showed up to Monte Alban after the Zapotec were the Mixtec. The Mixtec ruled a huge swath of Mexico from Oaxaca to Tlaxcala, from between 1000 and 1697. They held their power until around the time that the Spanish came with their boats and their guns and changed Central and South American history forever. It was the Mixtec people who filled the tombs of Monte Alban with unimaginable treasures. When archaeologists broke open the sealed entranceway to Tomb 7, they couldn't believe their eyes. The tomb was nearly overflowing with gold. The archaeologists uncovered exotic gold necklaces, mysterious pendants decorated with even more mysterious zoomorphic creatures, and impressive headdresses that may have been worn by royalty. They also discovered a massive golden mask and many other beautiful and mysterious artifacts that held clues about the lives and deaths of the members of this incredible ancient culture. Most of these treasures can now be seen on display in the city of Oaxaca at the local museums. Skulls of the Huns. When it comes to terrifying skulls, nobody can beat the Huns. The Huns practiced extreme cranial modification during the 4th century AD. At least 23 deformed skulls were found in the Republic of Georgia, 17 in the country of Hungary, 13 in Germany, and 2 in the Czech Republic. All of these deformed skulls date back to what is known in European history as the Great Migration, which lasted between the 4th and 7th centuries. This was the same time that the Huns moved out of Russia and into the territory of the Romans, killing, burning, and looting all that they could. For the Europeans, the Huns weren't just terrifying because they were savage warriors, they also looked imposing because their skulls were way too large. Many of the Hun warriors practiced cranial deformation, making them appear alien and horrifying to the Europeans they were invading. They literally looked like nightmare warriors. But what's curious is that after the Huns invaded Europe, locals started to deform their heads just like them. This is despite the fact that cranial deformation had fallen out of style with the rise of the Roman Empire. It had been popular during the Bronze Age, but nobody really did it any longer. until the Huns showed up and started a revolution. It was the influence of the Huns that led to another 300 years of skull modification. Asian mummies. Archaeologists have finally solved a bizarre mystery involving mummies that goes back 4,000 years. About 100 years ago, a small group of mummies were uncovered in China's Taklamakan Desert. At this point, mummies hadn't really been found in China before. For this reason, scientists believed the people must have come from the West, sometime during the Bronze Age. When they moved to China, they brought with them their Mediterranean practices of making mummies. But keep in mind that the discovery was made over a century ago. They didn't really have the technology to properly identify the mummies or look at their DNA. But now, Chinese researchers have finally traced the ancestry of the creepy mummies back to a group of hunters from the Stone Age. These hunters had nothing to do with Europe. In fact, they had been living in Asia for at least 9,000 years. According to the researchers, the mummies belong to members of the Xiaohe culture. Alison Betts from the University of Sydney says researchers know almost nothing about these people, other than that they were nomadic and apparently were mummifying their dead. Ancient battlefield. In Switzerland, researchers have uncovered an ancient battlefield that goes back over 2,000 years. It was found in the southeast of the country, not by professional archaeologists, but a regular guy with a metal detector. This individual, who had just been out waving his metal detector across the ground for fun, discovered the remains of what could have been an epic battle between the Romans and what they would have described as a tribe of savages. The metal detectorist found an old dagger, some stones that were used in slingshots, ancient coins, bent nails, and even a fragmented shield. It was enough evidence to get archaeologists with the University of Basel involved. When the professionals from the university came to investigate, they found even more objects. In fact, they found hundreds of pieces of old weaponry that indicate a battle between the Romans and a local Rhaetian tribe. The archaeologists were also able to date the objects back to the year 15 BC. According to archaeologist Peter Andrew Schwartz, the Romans attacked the tribespeople, who fired back at them with slingshots and makeshift catapults. It wasn't enough to keep back the fierce Roman offensive, and the tribespeople were subsequently wiped out. Ancient mercury poisoning. Some unusual bones have been uncovered in Spain and Portugal. In fact, quite a lot of bones have been found in Spain and Portugal. The bones of 370 people who lived throughout the late Neolithic and Copper Age. The bones date as far back as 5,000 years ago and have shown scientists the first ever evidence of mercury poisoning in humans. We know all about mercury poisoning today, but it took a lot of sickness and a lot of death for us to get a hold on it. Back in 2900 BC, people didn't know anything about mercury poisoning. But what they did know was that if they smashed cinnabar, it transformed into a bright red powder that they could use for painting or to get really high. A team of scientists with the University of North Carolina were interested in seeing how their use of cinnabar was affecting the ancient people in the area. So they looked closely at the bones taken from 370 people, excavated from 50 tombs across 23 archaeological sites. They discovered that the people had indeed been victims of mercury poisoning. The poisoning was because of their exposure to cinnabar, a mineral that forms naturally in volcanic areas across the world. In Iberia, cinnabar was used frequently for thousands and thousands of years as a pigment and as a medical substance. People even mined for it all the way back in 5300 BC. The issue for these ancient people was that they had no idea the cinnabar had mercury in it, and that it was wildly poisonous. They used the pigments to paint their body, sniffed it like a drug, and unwittingly poisoned themselves. Fortunately for them, it probably didn't cause too many issues since the average lifespan at the time was less than 30 years anyway. The Nebra sky disk. The Nebra sky disk is one of the most amazing artifacts ever discovered. Most experts agree it's at least 3,600 years old, originating from the Bronze Age. But what makes it so incredible? It's the oldest map of the stars in the world. UNESCO even includes the Nebra sky disk on its list of important historical documents. This treasure was found back in 1999 in Germany. The Nebra sky disk is a small plate emblazoned with gold symbols meant to represent the sun, the moon, and the stars. There are also representations of the solstices and other mysterious cosmic phenomena. But here's what's really interesting. Even though the artifact was found hundreds of miles from Stonehenge, there could be a link between the two. When Stonehenge was built in 2500 BC, its purpose had something to do with the movement of the sun. The Nebra sky disk is just about as old as Stonehenge and also depicts the movement of the sun. Experts say the sun was a central theme to European religions throughout the Bronze Age. Maybe whoever made the Nebra sky disk practiced the same religion as the people who built Stonehenge. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. The Tarim mummies. The Tarim mummies were discovered by European explorers in the early part of the 20th century, deep in the deserts of western China. Many of these mummies were pulled out of the Xiaohe tomb, where they had been sleeping soundly for thousands of years. The remains of the people buried became mummified because of the natural dryness of the desert. What was once a lush riverbank 4,000 years ago is now a desert of sand. The only things still surviving in that brutal wilderness are the tall, upright poles jammed into the earth to mark the burials. These poles have survived the test of time, showing exactly where archaeologists needed to dig. In total, the cemetery had about 300 bodies in it, but unfortunately, it had been pillaged by grave robbers a very long time ago. People were originally buried here in the Bronze Age around 3,000 years before today. It left a pretty big window for all the important relics to be taken out of the grave by looters. All that the thieves left behind were the shockingly ugly and frightfully dry faces of 300 prehistoric dead people. Siberian graves. In Siberia, archaeologists have uncovered an ancient grave that dates back 2,500 years. This grave holds the remains of 4 humans from the long-extinct Tagar culture. 2 of the individuals appear to have been warriors, a male and a female. The 3rd body belonged to a woman, while the 4th body belonged to an infant. Along with the remains, archaeologists found all kinds of amazing weaponry. They uncovered bronze daggers, war axes, and even battle knives. Plus, they found ancient items better suited to a prehistoric beauty parlor. They found bronze mirrors, fashion equipment, and even fancy combs made from animal horn. It's not clear exactly who these mysterious people were. The Russian Academy of Sciences says they were almost certainly a subculture of the Scythian civilization. They were buried with their weapons and beauty items just in case they needed them in the afterlife. As for how this strange group died, archaeologists say it could have been from illness. The warriors were in their 30s or 40s. The 3rd woman was older, somewhere in her 60s, and the infant was only a few days old. The family may have been stricken by some sort of disease that took them all out overnight. If it wasn't a disease, scientists have no idea what could have led to the deaths of all 4 individuals simultaneously. The bodies showed no evidence of violence, and the family of 4 just seems to have dropped dead at the exact same time. Canadian Vikings. The archaeological site of Lansdowne Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada is direct evidence that Christopher Columbus was not the first European to find the New World. Anyone who still believes Christopher Columbus was the first needs to look at this mysterious ancient place. 1 out of only 2 remaining settlements constructed by the Vikings approximately 1,000 years ago. A new article published in a reputable scientific journal has pinpointed the first Viking landing in Canada back to 1021. As you're watching this video, 1,000 years ago, a Viking was stepping foot on Canadian soil, 500 years before Christopher Columbus was even born. This amazing discovery was made by scientists with the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. They examined pieces of wood found at the site and then were able to carbon date them. They were also able to tell that the cut marks matched axes made by Vikings and not indigenous inhabitants of Canada. Back then, indigenous people did not yet have metal tools, but the Vikings absolutely did. Still, Lansdowne Meadows is a mystery because nobody knows why the Vikings didn't stay in Newfoundland. It could be that they hated the weather, that it was simply too far from the motherland, or something else entirely. After they established their settlement here, they vanished and never ended up spreading throughout North America. If they had, it would have certainly changed history as we know it. Celtic woman buried in a tree. In yet another unusual tree-related discovery, the ancient body of a woman was found buried inside a hollowed-out tree in Switzerland. According to the researchers, this woman died 2,200 years ago. She had been part of a Celtic tribe, perhaps even one of the most prestigious members of the tribe. She was discovered buried in very fine clothes and adorned with jewelry. The interesting thing is that the woman was not the only one of her kind to be buried in a tree coffin. Celts from the Iron Age frequently buried members of their tribes in chunks of trees. This particular burial comes from around the year 200 BC, with the woman being around 40 years old when she died. Her remains were found in the Swiss city of Zurich. Looking around at the modern capital now, it's difficult to imagine that it was once a tiny settlement filled with tribespeople. As for what made this woman so special, it comes down to her fine clothes and jewelry. Judging by the scraps preserved in her grave, archaeologists say she was probably wearing a dress of sheep's wool and a coat of sheepskin when she died. And because she was buried still wearing bronze bracelets, a huge bronze belt, and a necklace of amber and glass, experts say she was definitely a very important person. They just don't know why or how. Peruvian burial tombs. A team of archaeologists has discovered the remains of 29 people buried at an ancient Peruvian temple. While it's hard to say for certain, most of the dead people appear to have been used as human sacrifices, with at least 3 of them being children and 1 of them being a teenager. They were buried over 1,000 years ago in Huaca Santa Rosa de Pucallpa, located in the coastal region of Lambayeque. The bodies of the children and the teenager belonged to members of the Wari culture, while the other 25 bodies came from the Moche culture. The Wari flourished in the central Andes from between the 7th and 13th centuries. The Moche culture flourished right before them from between the 1st and the 6th centuries. The skeletons of the Moche people were found within clay tombs and special burial chambers, along with the sacrificed bodies of llamas and alpacas, and even guinea pigs. But the 4 bodies of the youngsters were discovered buried in the dirt at the front of the temple. These 4 had without a doubt been sacrificed. The big mystery here is trying to figure out why. The Moche had inhabited the region first, yet it was the Wari who built the temple. There seems to have been some kind of transitional period in which the last of the Moche were buried beneath the new temple, while those from the Wari's own tribe were sacrificed. Bones under the garage. In western Slovakia, a man was digging the foundation for his new garage when he made a terrifying discovery. He hadn't made much progress on his project before he uncovered a human skull. Assuming he had just come across the victim of a murder, he phoned the police. But after a bit of an investigation, another skull was discovered. Both of the skulls appeared to be extremely old. Radiocarbon dating placed them around the year 421 AD, or just about 1600 years ago. This was clearly an archaeological matter and not one for the police. Experts surveyed his property and discovered that he had a single grave with the body of 2 women inside of it. But nobody knows who these women might have been. The 400s and 500s were known as the migration period. This was when the Huns, the Lombards, the Goths, the Rugians, the Heruli all started moving into western Slovakia. People from all over Asia and Europe were spreading throughout Europe with great determination. This resulted in a lot of mixing of the various tribes, leading to a very diverse Europe. And to make matters worse, archaeologists didn't find any grave goods. This means the women had probably had their grave robbed, which was pretty common back then. Plus, one of the skeletons had been smashed as if someone had trampled on it while searching for treasures. St. Augustine shipwreck. In 2021, a group of volunteers went down to Crescent Beach in St. Augustine, Florida. Their job was to dig up what experts say could be a shipwreck from the 19th century. The volunteer researchers, in participation with the St. Augustine Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Program, found proof of a smashed vessel hidden beneath the sand. And so far, they have already uncovered a huge portion of the ship's hull. The ship is believed to be the Caroline Eddy, a merchant vessel that sank back in 1880. This is based on a log kept by the keeper of the St. Augustine Lighthouse. The keeper detailed how the Caroline Eddy was struck by a storm at least 9 miles out at sea. The ship sank before it ever reached the shore. Then, over the next few years, it was pushed all the way onto the beach by the shifting tides. The wreckage was covered over with sand and then lost for 140 years, until a storm in 2020 revealed it yet again. While the volunteer archaeologists haven't found any actual treasure, they do say that based on the size of the timber used to build the vessel, it was definitely a cargo ship. That means that even if there isn't treasure buried with it on the beach, There is likely goods, artifacts, and perhaps even treasure still sitting at the bottom of the sea. It's just waiting to be found. Sunken gold. Amateur freedivers have discovered gold treasure from the fall of the Roman Empire. The divers were swimming along the coast of Spain when they noticed something shiny glinting from the rocks below. Upon closer inspection, the shiny objects turned out to be coins from 1,500 years ago. After more and more digging, they realized they had an actual treasure hoard on their hands. It has since been recorded as one of the largest gold coin hoards found that dates back to the Roman Empire. The freedivers took a small sample of the coins that they found and got a hold of some archaeologists from the University of Alicante. Then, with the help of the archaeologists, they went back and uncovered a total of 53 gold coins. They've been dated from between 364 and 408, the years in which the Western Roman Empire was in major decline. The Roman emperors depicted on the coins include Valentinian I, the Second, Theodosius I, Arcadius, and Honorius. But coins weren't all that they found. They also uncovered copper nails and the deteriorated remains of a sea chest. In other words, the coins had been stashed in some sort of treasure box when they got lost at sea. How they wound up underwater is anyone's guess, though it's likely the chest came from an unknown shipwreck. After 1,500 years submerged, the chest disintegrated and the gold coins got swept away in the current. Thanks for watching! What's your favorite discovery? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and come back soon. See you later! Bye!